Hi guys, welcome to lesson 2 for Photoshop CS5 Extended Essentials. Today we'll be talking about making selections, editing and type design. So let's get started. In our last lesson we talked about the interface and I showed you a bit about the tools, not much though. So we're going to open a new document. There are a lot of tools in Photoshop and there's a tiny little arrow at the edge of each icon of the tool, so click and hold to see all of the tool options that you have. This is the Move tool, the Selection tool, the Lasso tool, Magic Wand tool or Quick Selection tool, Crop, the Eyedropper, Color Sampler tool, and so on, the Healing Brush tool, the Brush tool, which also includes the Pencil tool, Color Replacement tool, and so on, the Clone Stamp tool, Pattern Stamp tool, and so on, History Brush, Eraser, and then there are different kinds of erasers, the Gradient tool as well as the Paint Bucket tool, Blur tool, Sharpen and Smudge, Dodge, Burn and Sponge, the Pen tool as well as other kinds of pen tools and supplements to the pen tool, the Type tools, right now we'll just stick with Type, Paint Path Selection tool, Direct Selection tool, Rectangle tool, and so on. And then you also have tools specifically for the 3D section in Photoshop, such as the 3D Object Rotate tools and Move tools, as well as the 3D Rotate Camera tools. Then you have your Hand tool, Rotate tool, which we discussed in the previous lesson, and the Magnify tool. Now let's stick with the arrow, which is also called the Path Selection tool. So one of the main tools that you'll be using a lot, and let's open an image so that it's better understood, is the selection tools, and you'd be using a lot of them for an image. For example, let's just take this one. This is a great image. Again, you can use any image for this. There's a lot of different kinds of selection tools. You have the rectangle selection tool, which selects in a rectangle. You have the elliptical tool, which selects in a circle. If you hold Shift, it adds on to the selection, and if you hit Alt, it decreases or deletes from the selection. Single row marquee tool selects one pixel, one row of pixels horizontally, and single column selects one column horizontally. This is great if you're doing the web design and you just need one pixel for a background and you're going to repeat that background multiple times across the web, so it's great for that. Hit Command D to deselect, and that's it. You also have the Lasso tool, so this allows you to draw and select whichever area you'd like manually, as well as the Polygonal Lasso tool, which selects in angles. It cannot curve. As well as the Magnetic Lasso tool, which latches on to similar pixels. It's not very accurate, so after you do this, you always have to use a manual selection tool to work on it properly. So, for example, if I just wanted the face of the girl, the magnetic tool would latch on to all of the girl's features, just the lighter pixels, and just hit enter when you're done. So just go around, hit enter, and you're done. And that's basically the manual selection tools. The quick selection tool, however, is much more advanced. For example, if I wanted the girl's face, you'd click and drag particular areas, and you'd click and drag in short bursts. Try not to do too much, because if you do too much, you'd have to undo it. And to undo, you can always go into the quick selection tool area and select the subtract from selection brush. There are 3 brushes within the quick selection tool: new selection, add to selection, which is selected by default when we pick quick selection, because you're always going to be adding to selection until it's done, and subtract from selection. You can also choose your brush size and how hard you want the brush to be, whether you want it to be softer, whether you want it to take more pixels into consideration or less, how much spacing is there between the brush, so on. If you pick sample all layers, and if we had multiple layers, what it would do is it would sample all the layers within Photoshop, and this results in it takes long. Sometimes it can take a lot longer for the quick selection tool to work at that point, because it's not only working on your active blue layer but also on the layers below it. And auto enhance selects multiple edges, as you can see. Before, it has a higher threshold than usual. And that's how the quick selection tool is used. It's pretty useful. It's more intuitive than the magnetic lasso magnetic tool, and definitely much better than the magic wand tool. As you can see, the magic wand tool doesn't have as much tolerance, whereas the quick selection tool, you can just keep adding on or keep subtracting from the image. Sort of like a brush, which is kind of what it is, a selection brush. Command D to deselect. Now for the selection panel. So we just went over some of the selection tools, the rectangle, elliptical, and so on selection tools, the lasso tools, the quick selection, and magic wand tool. Basically what the magic wand tool does is it selects similar pixels, but it has a lower tolerance than the quick selection tool. So it's great for a quick selection, but it's not as good as the actual quick selection tool. Now, if you go into the select menu, you have various options. You can pick select all. For now, let's pick select all. Then when you do that, you have deselect open to you, and inverse. So let's just try selecting a particular area. Example, just her eye, just that part of her face. Now if you picked select all, it would select the entire image. If you pick deselect, it would deselect the selection that you just made. If you inverse, it would select the opposite of what you've selected. So if you've selected this area, it would invert the selection and select whatever was around her instead of the area that you've just selected. And if you go to refine edge, you can choose, as you can see, her face is gone. So basically removes her face, or not really, and refines the edge of the selection of your image. So show the radius, show what we've been working on, show the original, and use the smart radius for better. And then if you hit OK, her face isn't actually gone, but it does select better. We need to zoom in so that this can be seen better. So again, if we go into select, refine your edge, the white area denotes the area that's selected. Include a larger radius so that more pixels get selected. Adjust the edge so it's smoother. Feather increases the spread, but in a glow kind of way. It's sort of like using an actual feather over your image, where it softens the edge of the selection. And there we go. Shift edge increases the edge slightly. Remember the selection, and you can choose how you want the selection to turn out. Would you like it to become a layer mask, a new layer with a layer mask, a new document with a layer mask, and so on. For now, output to selection is OK. Just hit OK. And instead of the area that we just saw selected, it's selected a little more than that. You can also modify your selection. Instead of going to refine edge, you can modify the border by say 4 pixels, and it's selected the border instead of the image. So if I hit Command X, as you can see, I just cut out the edge of the image. You can also ask to select or expand or smooth the selection that you currently have. Let's smooth it by 10 pixels to see what happens. So automatically this has become a lot smoother, a lot rounder. As you can see, this was before a bit more jagged, a bit more rough, and now it's more rounder. If you go to expand, it expands your selection by as many pixels as you'd like. Right now, 10 pixels. You can also contract your selection by 10 pixels. And because it's inverted, because it's inverted, that's why it looked like it was the opposite. Let's inverse it again so you can see what happens. So if we expand by 10 pixels, it expands to a little more than our face, a bit too much actually. And if we contract by 10 pixels, it reduces back to the same size that we originally selected. Again, you can choose feather, which is a sort of the similar thing that we did in Refine Edge. You can choose to feather by 10 pixels so that if you cut out the image, it creates a glow. It doesn't really cut out in a harsh way. It actually cuts out in a soft way. So it's cutting out from here, most likely, and about 10 pixels onwards, it's more of a softer gradient approach to selecting the image. You can choose to grow, and it automatically picks the most similar colored pixels. You can choose for it to choose more similar pixels, and again, it's choosing more and more similar pixels. You can choose to transform your selection. Let's zoom out so you can see it. And a transform box has appeared. And you can even remove. So if we did that and hit Command D, it's not really viewable. But as you can see, for example, if I selected this area, and if I hit transform selection, reduced it, and that basically resizes your selection for you and moves it around. You can even save your selection and where you want to save it to, whether you want to save it to a particular channel, what kind of document. Hit OK, and it's gotten saved. That's it. Just undid everything that we did. If you go to color range, and this is pretty interesting, but if you pick a sampled color, for example, purple, and I just want this color to load. So if you have done the tutorial in our last class, this is a fairly easy way actually to isolate a color from an image. So first off, you've got to desaturate this image. Go to select, go to color range, select the color in this image. And it selected that particular color. Hit Ctrl X, and there you go. So the purple in the image has been removed quite simply. And that's a very quick way to isolate an object from a background using color range. Creating color-based selections and saving selections is the next topic that we're going to talk about. So now that we've gotten done with all of these tools, let's look into how to save a selection. So for example, if we had just her face selected, you can choose to save the selection as a particular channel, as an alpha channel to be exact. What happens is that if we go into window, pick the channels window, let's bring it up here so that we can all see it. And if you choose to save selection as a channel, give it a name. Let's call it Alpha 1. It will save within this document as a channel to the We'll save to this current document that we're working on, hit OK, and we have an alpha channel selected. This is a great way to create channels, especially for later on, for any editing that you might want to do. It's just pretty handy, especially if you have a lot of layer masks and so on to work with. We go into layer masks much later actually, so not to worry about that. Also, how to create color-based selections. Let's deselect. Let's pick color range and work with the selection, for example. So you'd have to use the quick tool brush. Now normally you would have to press shift to add to an image, but the quick selection tool doesn't really need shift, so this is a quick way of working. Actually, let me duplicate the layer so that you can better see the effect. Duplicate the layer again. And if we go to color range, and we've just done this based on selection. This would end up being the black and white image. However, if we selected according to the image and not according to the selection that we just made, so if we selected according to the image, for example, just her skin color, hit OK. All of the colors that are similar to what we just sampled would be selected, except for the background. So this is a pretty quick way to isolate color from an image. Kind of like exactly like the first assignment in the lesson 1, but this is a much easier way to isolate color from an image with selection. And that's it. Okay, so now that we know how selections work out, in our last class we talked about adjustment and adjustment layers, and I said that there were 2 ways to add an adjustment to your image, either from the image and menu or to add one from here. And it's recommended to add one from here, but I didn't really show you how to do that. So if you click on any of your adjustments, for example brightness and contrast, automatically a slider pops up and you can choose how much brightness you want in the image, how much darkness. I actually quite like the darker version of this rather than the brighter version. It looks more intense. So we're going to stick with this. You can also change the opacity of the image, whether you just want it to blend. So this is the effect, as you can see. It's more dull, now it's more vibrant. And you can also adjust the fill. And the reason fill and opacity are different from each other is that fill deals directly with the pixels of the layer, whereas opacity sort of applies a black to white approach where it's transparency. It doesn't really refer to the color of or the solid pixels within the image. So opacity has a less strong effect compared to fill. And that's basically how you use adjustment layers. You can also delete them. You can add new ones or add certain presets as well. There are all kinds of adjustments. Again, we talked about this within the image. It's too dark, too bright, and it's negative. Okay, so we talked about a lot of different adjustments in the first lesson. And again, I quite like this effect. We're going to stick with this. You can reduce the fill, play with the layer blending modes, and so on. You can even, and you might notice this has the layer mask, you can even erase certain parts. Use the brush tool to erase certain parts of the layer. For example, I want her face to be darker, but I want the background to be lighter. So there we go. That's one quick way to fix it. Or I want her hair to remain as glossy, or you know, some of the detail was lost in the hair and you want to keep that. You can use the layer mask which is provided with the adjustment layer to fix it up while keeping the detail. So this is a more refined way of working, and definitely one of the main ways a lot of people work in Photoshop. Understanding layer masks. Right next to the adjustment tool, and I just talked about layer masks a bit, we have the mask panel, and what this does is, if you click on the tiny black square or rectangle with the circle in the middle, it adds a layer mask to your image, and a layer mask basically masks your image or masks the layer. So it right now it's white. White means that all of the image is visible. Black means that it's not visible. You use the brush tool on the layer mask, make sure the layer mask is selected, not the image, and you can tell by the white border around the selection. So if you wanted, let's make this an overlay so we can tell the difference. If supposing this is a bit bright, you can reduce the brightness of the image by going into layer masks. You can also bring it back by painting it white again. So it's a non-destructive way of working, especially in Photoshop. You want to make sure that you have as many options available to you as possible. So this is one way of working. And that's basically what a layer mask does. Black means that it is completely opaque or it can't be seen, and white means that the image is viewable. So layer masks help fine-tune that. And there are a lot of different ways you can access it, either from the tiny menu here. You can go to your masks panel over here. As you can see, you can even pick the density and the feather of the mask. So if, for example, if I just wanted this area, for example, a tattoo got pretty wiped out and I want that part to show again, I want her hair to show again, certain highlights of the image to show again. If you want the density or the impact of the mask to be reduced, you can choose to do so. So right now I've made those areas black, and those areas would be rubbed out if the density or opacity, in a sense, was at full. But if I moved it to 0, it's like it doesn't exist. So again, so you can play around with the opacity, with the density of your layer mask. Play around with the feathering of the layer mask. So whatever we just did, we can expand it and include other areas and have a more gradual effect rather than a very harsh effect of the layer mask. But you can also mask the edge. And also work in color range with layer masks. So the layer mask is kind of like a separate layer, but it's basically like a cover on top of your original layer, and you're specifically working with those layers. So again, if we duplicated this, but let's disable the layer mask. This is what it looks like now. But with the additions that we made, this is what it looks like. So again, this is what it looks like now, very whited out. And this is what it looks like now. It's got detail, but it's not completely washed out the person in the middle. You can also invert. So whatever parts I've made dark, it's been inverted, so this part has become light and these areas have become dark. And that's basically it about layer masks. Creating gradient masks, it's actually a lot like the brush tool that we used on the layer mask, except instead of the brush tool, we're using the gradient tool. So let's just delete this mask. No, don't apply the mask. I don't want to apply the mask. And pick a new layer mask for the layer that we're currently working on, called background copy. So, like I said, actually, the image or the layer mask, if it's white, you can see the entire image. And if it's black, the image is not visible. So black removes part of the image and white means that the image is visible. Keep that in mind whenever you're using a layer mask. So when we go into gradients, of course, we're only going to be working with black and white or black and transparent gradients. And you can apply from any angle. And as you notice, every time I apply a gradient, it doesn't affect the gradient that I've applied before. In fact, it just applies it as a new gradient right on top. So in this way, you can experiment which angle you would like the gradient to be. I think this way is best. So this side gets a little duller and this side's a little brighter, so her face comes into focus. But you can also pick how you want the gradient to be displayed. For example, I want it like this. And you have half of it in gradient and half of it is not. You can also pick the gradient to appear as this. And if I hit Alt-click, you can see that this is what the gradient looks like. This is what the gradient looks like. If I pick this kind of gradient, this is what the gradient looks like within the layer mask. And this is what it ends up looking like on the digital image. And that's basically how you use a gradient mask. If you want to create a customized gradient, for example, you just don't want a one-directional gradient, you can use the black to transparent and just apply particular areas where you want it to be darkened or lightened. Again, now it's completely black, so you have to move to the white gradient, hit Shift, and there we go. And that's basically how you use gradients in layer masks. And that's the end for part 1 of lesson 2. In our next part, we are going to talk more about applying layer blend modes, snapshots in the history brush, the retouching tools including content aware fill, and tons more. So stay tuned and see you soon.